This episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 3rd of October 2023 at home in Wicklow. It's October, just like that. Happy October, listener. In this week's episode, I jump around a few different things, but representation is a theme. Representation, who is represented, what is represented, what issues are represented, and that comes in my head after listening to an episode of a really interesting podcast that I sometimes check out on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and it raises questions for me about the motives of politicians, and it also leads me to ask the question, or maybe to answer the question, what is the whitest film ever made? So, that's there. And then I finish up with a little, it hasn't happened yet, but it's a proposal. It's a proposal of a new little expression of something I'm interested in, maybe a little offshoot of the podcast, something to do with men. Are you a man? Are you a real man? Maybe it's time for you to man up, as I heard an old friend of mine say very recently about a man that she knows. Time to man up. What does that even mean? I don't answer that question today. That'll take another episode. Okay, so there you go. That's what's coming up. I hope you can find time to listen. Thank you for being here if you're here already. You have to be here already if you're listening to this. Go on. I'll see you around the corner. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind. Leaving the dream behind. Keep my emoji.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for pressing play. Thanks for choosing this particular podcast over the many others you could have chosen. If you are a return listener, so good to have you here again. And if it's your first time, you're welcome. And what you're stepping into here is an ongoing exploration of personal coping, resilience, the embrace of vulnerability, a general leaning towards wellness, and a wellness that I like to ground or foreground in reality, authenticity, and a little bit of calling BS on a lot of the performative, curated wellness that is put out there in the world that I'm deeply cynical about. And The Clear Out is my offering of an antidote. But it's not a cynical podcast. It's not skeptical. It tries to stay in a place of curiosity and openness. And yes, mostly it's my own perspectives, my own reflections, my own reactions to things, and I bring my own backgrounds into play, and my backgrounds are acting and education and martial arts, so they're primarily where I've spent most of my time, but I've always remained in this area of on my personal journey, an area of nurturing or exploring the mind, body, spirit unity, and trying to give love to the areas of myself, my psyche, my internal landscape, to give love to the areas that need it, to give nurturing and nourishment. And that's what I advocate generally for all people, to be patient with ourselves, to be tolerant of our failings, to be encouraging and supportive of the little embers of possibility and hope and positivity and personal ambition or aspiration, and largely to be kind to ourselves as the starting point to help us encourage our own empathy to others, and to remain open to conversations and different points of view. So I don't always do this. I don't always summarize the raison d'etre of the podcast. But I have done a little bit lately. Often that's just for myself as well. not just for you, the listeners. But it's helpful, I think, if it's your first time visiting, it's helpful to hear that. Now, that said, today I'm not entirely sure where I want to go with today's episode. There's always a few different things rolling around my head, a few different marbles in the can. I just finished listening to an hour. I haven't finished it, but I finished an hour of a recent episode of the Higher Learning podcast, in which Van Lathan Jr. and Rachel Lynn Lindsay, the co-hosts, their podcast is fundamentally about Black America, pop culture, politics, social issues, Black pride, Black history, whatever. It's all in there. I find it really interesting. I don't listen to it all the time, but I always enjoy it when I do. And one of their recent episodes, they interviewed a Republican politician named Larry Elder. He's Republican, conservative, and he's also Black. And he is sort of ideologically in a very different corner to the hosts of Higher Learning, who like to interrogate and legislate, the history of Black America, the current state of Black America, issues related to or indicative of systemic racism. And I always find they engage with those topics and those issues with great kind of honesty and transparency, and they bring passion and intelligence and their own backstories, and I find it I just find it interesting, stimulating, educational. I really like what they do there, but man, this episode, holy hell, that politician, I'd never heard of him before. You're just going, politicians are just so slippery and arrogant and dishonest and disingenuous and just maddening, so frustrating. And I can feel that the episode is building towards something explosive in terms of the interaction between the hosts and the guest. But my goodness, I'm just listening to this guy going, what do you represent really? Like, what's the game here? What are you trying to achieve? And again, I come away with the conviction I often have about politicians is it's just their own personal ambition. It's not really about representation at all. Because when you hear them speak, you're kind of going, no, I'm not getting a sense of genuine care, genuine vocation. I just hear someone who's pathologically ambitious and bullheaded, and almost sociopathic, because there's such a lack of interest in listening. There's such a lack of interest in having a true exchange. But yeah, if you have any interest in American politics, in representation, in Black America, it's well worth listening. So yeah, once again, the name of the podcast is Higher Learning, and that recent episode, the interview with Larry Elder. I'm sure you'll find it very easily. So I've kind of come away from that just feeling a bit like, like you're listening to people argue or have a discussion, and you can just feel one person just isn't playing. They haven't come to play fair. They haven't come to really have a true back and forth. And I just found myself getting so frustrated listening to it, frustrated for the hosts, frustrated with Larry Elder's whole kind of vibe, which is quite combative and belligerent. So yeah, anyway. Now, I suppose if I'm talking about that, one thing I could talk about, and this will take me to the world of movies, and this is it's very relevant to the conversation I was just listening to, because it is about sort of black representation and black visibility and black social mobility. And again, like, the hosts would be of the opinion that, black people in America are still massively, proportionately speaking, disadvantaged compared to their white counterparts. And that is because of, historical wrongs and injustices and manipulations and thefts, as well as out and out racial terrorism. I mean, I've never felt suspicious of that truth. I've never disbelieved it. It's always felt entirely plausible to me, observing from afar. And I think, in general, if you're talking about any form of discrimination, being disputed or reframed or narrativized by the power holders, are people who have thrown in their lot with, traditional institutional power and traditional power holders, whether that's in government or in finance, finance business, if it's in education, if it's in housing, movies, in entertainment. It's a dynamic you can't trust. Power holders want to hold on to power. I think that's, it's human nature. Nobody wants to go backwards. Nobody wants to step down the ladder. And that's relevant for all of us. It doesn't have to be into the political or sociological sphere. Just in our own lives, we don't like to step backwards. We don't like to go back down the ladder. We like to maintain our improved status, and usually have a sense of wanting it to improve further, to one degree or another. Everyone has to decide how much they feel is truly enough, what they believe is truly the place of, now I don't have to worry about this anymore. I've probably never had that in my life. And this is probably the first time in my life I'm truly like, I don't know if this is sustainable. And my wife was just sort of folding her arms and nodding her head slowly, silently, going, that's right. That's right. But if I focus just on one aspect of this, and we talk about how movies in particular can be a mirror to what people believe to be true. Movies can be a mirror, certainly can be, they can be an indication of what studios believed people wanted to see. And one strain of movies would be, we want people to feel good about themselves. We want to give them something that makes them feel, positive about where they're at and reflect a current mood. Sometimes it's the opposite. It's meant to tap into anxieties. You think of so many of the movies that came out post Vietnam, and post the era of social revolution in the States, and post Watergate, and how the cynicism of those times started to be reflected in movies, sometimes very literally with political thrillers, but often in movies that were incredibly nihilistic and violent and brutal. And I'm not talking specifically about Vietnam movies. I referred a few episodes back to that fantastic podcast on the Ringer Network, which was part of the Big Picture is the actual podcast, and it was a series they did called was it called Do We Get to Win This Time, which is basically a history of Vietnam as interpreted through American movies. It was really, really fascinating, and again, I recommend you go and listen to that if you have any interest in that period of American history, and if you like movies, it's an absolute winner. But yeah, so to an extent, movies always they're always a kind of a reflection of current tastes, current interests, current truths. But historically, of course, they can be a reflection of omission. They can be a great example of who are we not looking at, who is not being seen, and whose story is not being told. So if I bounce that idea off what I was just talking about before, with the subject matter of that higher learning podcast and that episode in particular, the movie I'd like to talk about is The Big Chill. And The Big Chill is a 1983 American movie directed by Lawrence Kasdan. And it was, it's considered the movie of a generation, which would be my parents' generation. And coincidentally, I watched The Big Chill about a year ago. I'm not sure why it came into my head then, but I rewatched it. And there was a slight difference in how I viewed it. Like when I watched it last year, I just had a different viewing experience, and I watched it again last week because the movie podcast I like to listen to, the Rewatchables, they did an episode on it, and it made me want to revisit it. And they spoke in a very absolute way that about it being this movie of a generation. And I was just on that point alone, I was thinking, well, yeah, maybe a generation of white Americans. I don't think it was massively resonant to people in Ireland at that time. In 1983, it was a very poor time. There was a recession. Not the most joyous time in Irish history. And I certainly don't think it was the movie of a generation for Black Americans. And that was really, when I watched it last year, that's what struck me most was, wow, is this one of the whitest films ever made? Because, yeah, it's like basically, okay, so the Big Chill, if you're not familiar with the movie, it's the story of a group of friends gathering to spend the weekend together after one of their dear friends has killed himself. And it featured a sort of a who's who of great American film acting talent in the sort of early years of their careers. But some of them, really in the sweet spot of their young careers. And so you have, on the female side of the cast, you had Glenn Close and Jo Beth Williams, Mary Kay Place and Meg Tilly. And on the male side, you had Kevin Kline, William Hurt, Tom Berenger and Jeff Goldblum. And the friend who died was played by Kevin Costner, and they shot scenes with Kevin Costner, but ultimately Lawrence Kasdan decided not to use them because it actually didn't add to the balance of the story. And I'm not sure if they actually used. I mean, I remember reading as a teenager that Kevin Costner's body was used as the corpse, who we see, which we see being prepared for the funeral in the opening credits. And so it's this sort of quite, I mean, I want to say like a gentle movie, and a very normal movie in terms of, well, what it's depicting is normal interaction. So sort of a gentle drama of friends spending time together and sort of checking in with themselves, with each other, and by virtue of this opportunity to come together, doing a sort of stock take of where they are in their lives and what it all means. And as I say, what struck me when I watched it last year, more than anything, what struck me was like, wow, it's just white. It's like these are the whitest representatives of the American experience that you could get. I mean, arguably Jeff Goldblum aside, who, compared to the others looks, subtly ethnic. If that's not an inappropriate way to put it. But the movie was also famous for its soundtrack, which just featured, a string of soul and Motown classics. Marvin Gaye. Yeah, he's a bit dull. Marvin Gaye and Smokey Robinson, Martha and the Vandellas maybe, and most memorably to me, when I first saw The Big Chill as a kid, Aretha Franklin's Natural Woman. But just great songs. Like it's kind of, it's almost, you can't believe, oh my god, another absolute banger. But yeah, again, catching all these actors in a real sweet spot in their kind of young adult prime, everyone looking really good. Tom Berenger in a typically light, almost comic role, and very, very charming with it. I mean, I feel like most of his career he's played tough guys. Maybe most notoriously in Oliver Stone's Platoon as a very nasty piece of work sergeant who's one of the sort of proxy fathers that Charlie Sheen's character swings between him and Willem Dafoe, who has such a tragic end in that movie, one of the most memorable scenes of any war movie of all time. But Tom Berenger, Kevin Kline, just doing that real easy touch Kevin Kline stuff that he does, just an assured performer. Little bit cheesy in places, little bit cringy, bit hammy. William Hurt, just on this amazing start to his career with one great performance after another, and there wasn't really anybody like him. Just a very, I paid tribute to William Hurt last year after he died, but just this really interesting actor, just his sort of cerebral nature, his softness, like a kind of an emotional softness that he projected, but also sort of bristling as well with that kind of coldness that comes from being very intelligent, and maybe being a few steps ahead of everybody else. And I think that was his secret sauce, and he did very well. particularly in that run through the early to late 80s. And then Jeff Goldblum, and you realise watching Jeff Goldblum in one of his relatively early appearances, just how distinctive the Jeff Goldblum thing is and was and has always been. His quirkiness, his unflappability, his charm, his intelligence, his height. He's just a great presence, and again a kind of an overconfidence or an arrogance that he sort of gets away with because he's kind of such a charming performer. My daughter and I watched him just recently in Thor Ragnarok, one of the Marvel superhero movies, one of the better ones, directed by Taika Waititi. Very funny, and Jeff Goldblum is in that, being very funny. But yeah, in any case, I mean, my own memory, I didn't see it when it came out because I would have been 9 in 1983, but I was aware of it probably a few years later. I had a book of, I think it was called Movie Lovers, and I'm pretty sure that was the book. It had all these black and white stills from lots of movies of different love scenes or lovers from movies, and not just American movies, international, and there were some great photos in it. And I'm sure there was one in that from The Big Chill, because there are romances happening between the friends. And so I was aware of it, and I could see, I knew the talent that was in it, and it would have been on my list. Yeah, I'll be watching that at some point. And then in 1989, an old American friend of my parents came to visit and spent a little bit of time with us one summer, and he brought his, I can't remember if she was already in university or just finishing high school, one of his daughters, and she had the soundtrack to The Big Chill with her. And so I had the image in my mind from the book, and then I heard the soundtrack, and I was like, oh my God, these songs are just extraordinary. I absolutely, loved them. And, that was it. Like, I was like, I've got to, I love the music. That was going to be its own separate relationship. And, has stayed with me over the years, my affection for that music. And, just a kind of a confirmation to me that, okay, this movie has something special going on. And I eventually got to see it, a couple of years later, and just thought, yeah, this is great, and was watching it with probably quite a non-critical eye, and just thought this is just wonderful to see all these great actors and actresses doing their stuff. But yeah, as I say, last year when I watched it, the unspoken politics of it, the unspoken representation issue of it was what struck me. Now, it didn't really detract from my enjoyment that much, but it was like, oh yeah, wow, there are no black faces in this movie, and it's an incredibly, like, there's an atmosphere of great sort of self-assurance in the movie, like not just in the telling of the story, but the kind of energy of the characters is like, this is all exactly as it should be. And as was pointed out on the Rewatchables podcast episode, they're all very successful. They're all doing very well, with the exception maybe of William Hurt's character. But they're all, successful lawyer, doctor, journalist, writer, whatever, TV actor, and they're all sort of enjoying their piece of the pie and living the American dream. So that is what kind of stayed with me last year when I watched it, an almost an air of blithe self-satisfaction, like it's all good, we're great. Now, it is something that is overtly addressed in different places in the movie, particularly from William Hurt's character, who kind of said, we never, our generation, no one's ever had it as easy as us. But again, if you're a black person at that time, I don't know how much you would have been loving that movie. You'd be like, okay, where are the successful black people? Where are the black faces? Where are the black actors? Who am I looking at? Should I, if I'm a young black person, should I aspire to be like William Hurt or Kevin Kline or Tom Berenger? I don't know. I don't know what that relationship is. I'm not informed, but I'm sure this movie is most popular with white Americans of a particular age. And then people like me. But that's okay. I'm just a film fan. But yeah, this time when I watched it last week, I just enjoyed the acting. I just enjoyed the ensemble playing and the warmth of the cast and the warmth between the actors and the sort of effortless and very naturalistic chemistry there. And again, from the Rewatchables podcast, they were talking about the rehearsal process, so all the actors, spent a week or two together before they started shooting, and really kind of, I guess, developed that rapport and that chemistry, and that's what comes off the screen, as well as just kind of good writing and good storytelling. But it does raise the question for me. Okay, so I'm not gonna stay on the kind of the specific political kind of question of it, or the social cultural implications of it. Lawrence Kasdan, he directed other movies, and I mean, if we're talking about representation, Danny Glover featured prominently in a couple of his movies, Grand Canyon, which I don't think has aged particularly well, and then the sort of light Western, a great Western, very entertaining, but again, slightly, comic campy elements to it at times, Silverado. And Danny Glover plays a great character in that. A black cowboy of great kind of integrity, who befriends, or is befriended by Scott Glenn's kind of protagonist. And they're the good guys. And Kevin Costner was rewarded with a great early role in that movie after being cut from The Big Chill, where he just brings something irrepressible and goofy and hyper confident to the role, and you kind of forget, oh yeah, Kevin Costner was that before he became what he became, which was much less interesting. So just it's not like Lawrence Kasdan was, I don't ever want to have black actors in my movies. I don't think that's the issue at all. But it does, it made me think in a more general sense, and it makes me think in a more general sense about the whole idea of representation. And funnily enough, another example of this comes to mind, and it is movie related again. Before I jump into the more general point, I just had a flash of one of my good friends, Harry Ian. If you're listening, Ian is an old university friend of mine, and he's embarking on a 5-day cycle this week. Just started today, the day of recording, and he's cycling down the northwest coast of Ireland, a stage a day for each decade of his life, because Ian's about to turn 50. But years ago, Ian was involved in a bit of youth work through, I think, the connection was one of his aunts, and he was watching an Irish film that has actually aged quite well called Into the West, which is sort of a road movie featuring two young brothers who happen to be members of the travelling community. For non-Irish listeners, the travelling community, also known as travellers, also known, I think, in Irish as na Mincéirí, are, for want of another word and the easiest kind of comparison, if you want to think of them as gypsies, that might be the easiest thing. And speaking of a class of people or a group of people in Ireland who have been routinely discriminated against, I don't know about systemically, but certainly culturally, in the history of modern Ireland, travellers are, I think, discriminated against and continue to be so, and they're still a bit of a taboo subject in Irish society. Again, and I think I may have mentioned this before. My mother, when I started her teaching career, taught traveller kids. So in my own experience, I've never had anything other than a positive opinion of them. And in my own interactions with them as a teacher, I always greatly enjoyed having them in my class, as I would with any student really. Generally, it's all open to whoever's there, but it's not a straightforward relationship. They don't occupy a straightforward position in Irish society because they have their own traditions and cultures, which means they're sort of moving on the outside of more traditional, conventional patterns of behaviour, I suppose. Again, I'm not here to litigate the travelling community. But Into the West was a successful movie. Gabriel Byrne, Ellen Barkin, Colin Meaney, Brendan Gleeson were probably the four main names in it. But it follows the journey of these two little kids who are kind of travelling across Ireland on a horse. And at one point in the movie, do they get to watch a movie? And there's a line in the movie they're watching, or it comes up somewhere, I'm misremembering this, I'm sure, but someone on screen says, "God bless the travellers." And my friend Ian was watching it, and when that was said, there was a little traveller boy beside him who just reached over and held Ian's hand and gave it a squeeze when "God bless the travellers" was said. And I always thought it was a lovely story, because there's something about I think there's something particularly moving about a child's experience of seeing themselves on screen. That speaks to me. I just find that resonates to me, and there's something very poignant and significant and perhaps profound about that. And I really believe in that whole idea of moments. I believe in moments, and I believe in gestures, and they can be life-changing experiences, because they're moments of, well, I believe that they are usually instances of being seen, or they're instances of arriving at a new place of understanding, for better or worse. And moments and gestures, the way I said it there, and that was my intention, I was thinking of positive moments and positive gestures, but of course the opposite can be just as true. Negative moments and negative gestures can be just as significant and just as impactful. But that story about Ian and the traveller kid reaching out and and giving his hand a squeeze when "God bless the travellers" was expressed on the screen, I always find it lovely and sweet and moving, and it just popped in my head there, just talking about that idea of representation, And again, like, just to spell it out, if this isn't obvious to you, or you haven't thought about it, just to lay out and just to step back into the Black American experience again, or my commentary on it. That idea of representation is, if you're a black person looking up at the screen, and in the majority of movies, what you're seeing is black people represented as gangsters, as drug addicts, as sex workers, as disenfranchised, or dumbed down or neutered or emasculated in the service of a white protagonist. That's then what you start to think is, oh, this is who we are, because this is all I see. And I'm not seeing other stories. I'm not seeing, heroic black protagonists. What's the story here? What am I meant to believe about myself? What am I meant to believe about my community? What am I meant to believe about what the colour of my skin means? The status it's afforded. And I mean, that would be the other typical representation in many movies of a certain period of time in Hollywood. Black people represented as slaves, as victims, as entertainers. So these very specifically allocated roles that are all about, that's your place, stay there, that's your place. So again, sorry, I mean, I know I'm kind of jumping back and forth. I mean, I'm only laying that out just in case that wasn't obvious to you already. Maybe it's not. But I bounce back then to now to the idea of representation in general. And it doesn't have to be as literal as I want to see myself. I want to hear stories about my experience. Or I don't see myself up there on the screen. I don't see myself in TV shows. It might just be things that you're concerned about. It might be just things that you're interested in. It might just be things, if I say the word omission, if I ask you the question, what's being omitted from the discourse? What's being omitted from the conversations that come before you again and again and again? I mean, that's going to lead you into this conversation about representation. And there was one thing I saw last week. I'm going to give a shout out to someone on social media. Her name is Lucy White, and from what I can gather from Lucy's Instagram feed is that she's a journalist, an occasional podcast reviewer. I'm not sure quite how I came across Lucy, but she put something very interesting up on her Instagram profile last week, which was basically about 6 screenshots of newspaper articles, and all of the articles were about something really bad that a man had done, a man or a boy had done. So different stories, violence, or some form of, criminal behaviour, or violence against women, or an act of vandalism. And I can't remember exactly what Lucy said. It was, it wasn't, what she wrote, I didn't find particularly provocative. I didn't think she was trying to, take some very exaggerated reactive position. In a way, the screen grabs spoke for themselves. But I think her general thrust was, men. Men continue to be, a problem, and these stories continue to trouble us and confront us. I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, the stories, that she chose to show on her Instagram page were, oh man, and I'd seen at least 2 or 3 of them, and one of them was the cutting down of the sycamore tree on Hadrian's Wall, on the border between Scotland and England last week. You just go, really, lads? What the hell are you doing? Really? Why? Is it just a stunt? I haven't gone back to look into that story more, but famously that tree was used in Kevin Costner's Robin Hood movie, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, from whatever year that was. The film that gave us the endless #1 from Bryan Adams, the name of which I'm going to forget now. Is it Everything I Do It For You? Is that it? Oh my goodness, I'm shameful. Anyway, but the tree features in that movie prominently. But yeah, it was chopped down last week by some teenager, apparently. I think there's another man implicated as well. But look, in any case, I'm name checking Lucy White, not to direct any disapproval or anger or invite her to be targeted. I'm like, she's absolutely in her right to raise this question, absolutely in her right to go, what's the story, lads? But something that I continue to be concerned about, I've no issue with calling out bad behaviour in anybody, but and this isn't a solution. This isn't a solution, but something that I continue to kind of be, aware of or sensitive to is that I feel like we don't see stories that celebrate the very everyday achievements of real men. And I'm deliberately using that word, real, because the phrase real man is a very loaded phrase. What's a real man? And I think for many of us, the phrase instantly gets pushed into an area of very alpha male stereotypes, macho, muscular, high achieving in areas of physical prowess or combat or whatever it might be. And I'm wary. I don't entirely trust that. I don't trust that as a definition of what a real man is. I'd say, who isn't a real man? I mean, we're all real men. We men. We're real men. And, if someone's transitioned to being a man and they identify as a man and they look like a man, and they want to pass as a man, I'm like, okay, you're a real man too. Why not? Because, let's just get on with it. And this idea, and this is something we explored in the show I was involved in earlier this year, Manifest, the show I did with Broken Talkers as part of the larger community arts project, What Does He Need? Which is an exploration of masculinity in boys on their journey to manhood in Ireland. Like it's specifically there, the Irish experience within different communities in Ireland. And I'm again involved in a youth project exploring this work as part of the What Does He Need thing. So it's very, very much on my mind. But again, to return to the idea of Omission, I want to see stories just about normal men doing, normal men, real men, real men just quietly going about their business, doing things that are family-based, community-based, standing by their partners, their wives, their husbands, whatever it might be, raising their kids, working their jobs, and are not can't be thrown into this frame of toxic masculinity, can't be thrown into this frame of misogynistic, abusive, violent behavior, who are quietly, anonymously going about their business and hitting their marks on a daily basis, because I do think that is a narrative. I do think that is a narrative, and I think it's a narrative that isn't celebrated, that isn't really spoken about, that isn't celebrated, fetishized, valorized, and it doesn't make the other behavior any less concerning. It doesn't make those stories any less true, and I certainly don't think it's Lucy White's responsibility to tell those stories. And again, none of this, I can't emphasize this enough. I'm not trying to go, go and have a go at Lucy White. Not at all. I'm just saying that was the starting point for this, this particular thought process. I was going, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I read those headlines on her Insta page. I was like, oh yeah, they're horrible. They're shitty. I don't like reading them. I don't like having to face that myself and go, what the hell? But again, if you think of what I said at the start of the podcast today about my offering here on the Clear Out, is I want to throw out an antidote to things that aren't helping us. I want to throw out an antidote to the lack of nuance in discourse around lots of different issues. But I continue to be very interested in men's issues, and how men are perceived in the media, how they're portrayed, what stories get told, and that is about representation. And I'm interested in stories about men who are just getting along with it, getting on with their lives, having their daily wins and fails, and are just trying to cope with their stuff. And as I've said many times before, I'm very lucky. I know lots of what I would consider good men, good lads, thoughtful, considerate, stand up, respectable guys who do right by their partners, do right by their families, and have never given me any indication over, I'm talking long friendships, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and I'm not looking at toxic men. I'm not looking at toxic masculinity. And those men give me the feeling of confidence that I have, that there are lots of men who are not beating up women, who are not locked into misogynistic thinking, who are not feeling like victims and feel they have to act out or fight back or reassert their masculinity in strange ways, who are looking after themselves so they can be good husbands, partners, fathers, brothers, sons, whatever it might be, who are coping honestly with their own demons and battles, who are seeking help professionally when they need it, and who, in my own experience, in terms of the very specific nature of my friendships with these men, who will speak very openly and honestly about their fears, their vulnerabilities, their anxieties, their concerns, their resentments, their fatigue, whatever it might be. And I know those conversations are strengthening. I know they're really useful. And I value those friendships enormously. I value those conversations enormously. And that's what I'd like to kind of see more of, as kind of as a, it's kind of like a by the way narrative, by the way, that stuff is happening and it's awful, but this is also happening. And I think it's part of sort of balancing the picture, and it's part of allowing that to be part of the story. And if we go back to the idea of, young people seeing what's out there, I think that's very relevant. I think that's the potential to be very resonant, because then they're seeing or hearing or reading or consuming other stories that are going, look at this guy, he's a father of 4 and he works 50 hours a week, and he has dedicated his life to being a provider, and is in a job he doesn't particularly love, but he loves his children and he loves his partner, and he's trying to do the right thing by them in tough circumstances, and he comes home and plays with his kids, or takes them to football, or takes them to ballet, or whatever it might be. And I'm not being particularly articulate in how I'm describing the possible model, because I think that can be wide open. There are many ways to contribute normally and functionally as a man to your community, to your to your family, and I think that these stories are neglected or are considered not particularly newsworthy. But see, obviously this is a reflection of my own values and my own personal philosophy and my own wellness. A key component of my own wellness strategy is to acknowledge the tiniest wins, the tiniest victories. And I have argued before, and I will continue to argue until I have a lobotomy, until I drop down dead. I will continue to argue. Even getting your ass out of bed in the morning, washing your face and stepping out into the world, that is a victory all of its own. Now that might not resonate with you. You might go, what are you talking about? It's a piece of cake. I mean, great. Well done you, and you're very lucky if that's the case. For many people, it's not a piece of cake. For many people, it's a slog. It's a grind. It's a monstrous effort. It's a mountain to scale every single day. And I just think if you can get yourself out the door, if you can step up and engage in spite of your burden, and it's not for anybody else to measure your burden and go, listen, that's not really heavy. Everyone has their own stuff. Everyone carries their own shit. And that's their burden, no matter what way you cut it. And this is my issue with some of our kind of, some of the extremities of woke politics, woke culture and identity politics. The speed with which people rush in to invalidate somebody else's experience. I have a real issue with that. I'm not in a position to invalidate anyone's experience because I only know my own experience. And that aspect of kind of the closed ears of, and in fairness, I probably shouldn't, I shouldn't castigate woke culture and identity politics, because it's actually just across the board. There's a lot of not listening, and there's a lot of knee-jerk dismissal of the other, with going every which way, up, down, left, right, gay, straight, trans, non-trans, whatever. There's a lot of I'm not interested. I'm only interested in my experience, and it's incredibly combative, and not particularly nuanced. I come back to what I was talking about earlier, referring to the higher learning episode. That there isn't a true exchange, because everyone's coming to the table with guns loaded. So this goes back to an episode a few weeks ago about dropping our assumptions and dropping our prejudices and not prejudging. And I don't think it's disingenuous to say like everybody's burden is their own, like everyone has their own thing and no one else can really quantify that. I mean, of course you can contextualize, and when someone like maybe Prince Harry, for example, goes on about his terrible life, and you realise, whoa, he really isn't in touch with the normal experience, which I could have guessed, being the son of one of the wealthiest royal families in the world. But there'd always be a part of me that would just, on a very human level, go, yeah, but that guy lost his mum in pretty horrible circumstances when he was a little boy. And I'd go, that's a burden, isn't it? And that's about it. I mean, I don't, whatever else, the pressures of being a royal, I'm like, okay, whatever. The pressures of enormous privilege. I'm sorry, I can't really go there. But, losing a parent at a young age, devastating. Keeping a parent who, not losing a parent who's really destructive, also devastating. So, you have to bring in the context, you have to bring in the nuance. But the starting position, I think, if there's any hope of increased understanding, if there's any hope of increased empathy, and increased empathy encourages listening, increased empathy encourages openness, and listening, they kind of calm us down, because we're coming in and going, it's okay, I can handle this. I don't have to be defensive. I don't have to be in a highly protective position. And that's going to drop the heart rate and make us feel calmer straight away. Now, you still may end up going, I don't believe a word this other person is saying. That's a crock of shit. But at least the starting point, come in calm. Don't come in hot. It usually doesn't. It usually doesn't have the desired effect. Yeah. So anyway, look. I'm probably just going to leave it there today. I do have a little idea, a sort of a side project related to this idea of normal men, real men's stories. Now I don't know. It might be a bit goofy. But I think, maybe that's something I should try and do here on the Clear Out. Maybe I can start doing that on my own social media feed, just to bring you the headlines, real men headlines. I'll give you one right now. Man in his 40s moves across country to take care of aging parents. That's a real man headline. Man in his 40s moves across country to take care of aging parents. That's my brother Danny. He did that. He's doing that. That's a real man headline. Okay? That's a story. So there's one guy, an imperfect guy, a flawed guy, like I am, like all of us are, doing what he can, stepping up, stepping into the role. Okay? So how about that? Let's finish with that today. That's a nice story. Here, I'll give you one more. Man, soon to turn 50, makes raspberry muffins with his daughter and her friend. That was my real man headline. That was me last Sunday. I made raspberry muffins with my daughter and her pal. Okay? I did that. Nobody got hurt. And they weren't misogyny muffins. Okay? There was nothing evil in them. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. So there you go. We went from black representation to raspberry muffins. It only took an hour. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you giving me your ears. I hope you found something to reflect on, something to be thoughtful about, something to object to and have a discussion about, something that made you laugh. And hopefully you feel better on the other side of this than you did before you listened. Hopefully it's been a positive experience, because that ultimately was the driving impulse to start this podcast, was to put a bit of positivity out there. And hopefully I've done that. Go safely. And remember, as always, if you enjoy the podcast, throw me some love on social media, all the usual channels. I'm there. You'll see the links wherever you're listening to this podcast, but YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can email me at theclearoutlive@gmail.com if you want to share anything on there. Otherwise, like, rate, comment, review, share, subscribe. And if you're so motivated that you think, yeah, I want to throw a bit of money behind this independent podcast, you can. You can use the Patreon link. That's patreon.com/theclearout. And I'd be very grateful for anything you can contribute. This does take effort, in spite of anything I've said in the past. It does take effort. It's not always easy. It's something I care about, I'm passionate about. I get something out of it. I hope, I want other people to get something out of it as well. But it does come at a cost. It comes at a cost in terms of the home life balance, the economic balance. And so, if you think this is, that's worth the price of a coffee. That's worth the price of a pint, the price of a sandwich. You can make that contribution on a regular basis by subscribing to Patreon and becoming a benefactor of this show, this tell. And genuinely, no messing, anything you give, I'm like, that is absolutely brilliant, and I would be truly grateful, because it's a validation. I find it enormously encouraging. I find your comments on social media enormously encouraging, as long as they're positive. That's it. I'm out. It's time to bring my daddy for a haircut. There you go. There's another real man headline. Man takes father for a haircut. It goes well, hopefully. I can't tell you that yet. Mind yourselves, travel safe, stay positive, stay thoughtful. And I'll be back next week with something else. All the best. See you. Bye.